You know how many times users searched football on eBay.com last season? Try 12,000 per hour. That's because eBay has been the home of collectibles since 1995 with an unrivaled selection of trading cards and memorabilia. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's ebay.com/theathletic. Get busy building your collection today.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
If you love iPhone, you'll love Apple Card. It comes with the privacy and security you expect from Apple. Plus, you can earn up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase, which can automatically earn interest when you open a high-yield savings account through Apple Card. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app. Subject to credit approval, savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility. Apple Card and Savings by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Member FDIC. Terms and more at applecard.com.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome back to And Colossally That's History. As regular listeners will know, this is a podcast that reappraises motor racing history, though on this episode we're taking a slight left turn as my co-host Richard Williams and I are actually going to be reappraising a fair bit of fictional motor racing history too.
That's right, Matt. It's time for everybody to grab your popcorn. Well, actually, no, don't. I hate people who eat popcorn in the cinema and even more people who eat popcorn on the sofa. Because this week we'll be winding the clock back to 1966, a year when Formula One was thrust into mainstream consciousness with the release of John Frankenheimer's epic and more than somewhat controversial movie Grand Prix. Now, you might be saying, why are you reappraising a film? It's not even real motor racing history. But it sort of is, and we'll explain why.
Yes, it sort of is, and indeed we will. So now, as we record this podcast, many of you listening will probably have seen the trailer for the forthcoming Brad Pitt movie about Formula One, which has been imaginatively titled F1. Although, to be fair, Grand Prix is hardly a more imaginative title any more than the 1971 movie Le Mans was, or the 2010 movie Senna was, or indeed the 2023 movie Ferrari was. What is it with motor racing movies and unimaginatively obvious titles, Richard?
Well, they're probably better titles, all those, than Death Drives Through, a silent movie that was made at Brooklands in the 1930s. That one featured a punch-up in the paddock.
Sounds like a snuff movie. Anyway, one day I'm sure there'll be a Formula One movie entitled Lewis. You just know it, don't you? Anyway, I hope and trust it'll be a good movie. Anyway, it'll be called Lewis. The unimaginatively titled movie F1 is set to come out next summer, in other words, the summer of 2025. And what's interesting is that the filmmakers have followed a similar blueprint to the one used by Frankenheimer, in the sense that it's been shot on location at Grand Prix, weaving their fictional characters into the real world of Formula One. So we thought now would be a good time to go back and re-examine the movie Grand Prix. Because whatever your opinion of it, and it's garnered, pun intended, mixed reviews over the years, which we'll come to later, it also stands as an excellent document of Formula One at the time, because it's not all fiction. It's actually part documentary, as we'll explain. Richard, Grand Prix is a movie that I'll admit I've watched only 3 times, once about 40 years ago, once again about 20 years ago, and once again just the other day in preparation for recording this podcast. But you've watched it loads of times, haven't you? Including at the cinema when it first came out, when you must have been about 57. Sorry, when you must have been 19 or 20, I guess.
Exactly so.
Yes. We'll talk about its dramatic failings later, because I do think it does have some, sadly. But before we do that, would you agree with my assessment that, how can I put it, it's an excellent document of that period of racing, the mid-60s, I mean. And so I'll ask you, what was it like as a young racing fan to go to see it in the Nottingham Coronet, was it, perchance?
The Odeon, in fact.
The Odeon, but Nottingham.
Indeed.
Yes. When the only moving images of their sport, your sport, that motor racing fans usually got to see was the odd bit of black and white British Pathé footage.
Well, yeah, I did see it as soon as it came out in the UK, which was early in 1967. And, of course, I've been looking forward to it very much. For a start, when Grand Prix racing was televised, which wasn't often, it was still in black and white, as you say. And this wasn't just in 70mm Super Panavision, but in full colour. I did actually know that Grand Prix racing was in colour, because I'd been to a Grand Prix.
You knew Ferraris were red.
I did, yeah. But anyway, it was, something to see on the TV, on the cinema screen in full colour. And it really was an epic. It was 3 hours long. And when you went into the cinema and sat down, there was actually an overture written by the composer Maurice Jarre before the actual film started. And like Ben-Hur and Cleopatra, which were other great epics of the 60s, it actually had an intermission. So, and then there was another kind of mini overture before the second half. So going to see it felt like an event.
Can I interrupt you for just a second? That overture has always struck me as a bit odd. Okay, the Maurice Jarre music is very nice. You probably don't like the word nice. You can take issue with it if you wish. And the screen is filled with a great still pic of the Monza banking. But staring at it, in my view, my humble opinion, pulls after 4 minutes, because it lasts 4 minutes or a little bit longer. I think I'm going to have to say, I think the movie The Italian Job did a similar thing much better 3 years later, in 1969, with a Lamborghini Miura sweeping along a beautiful mountain road to the accompaniment of the golden voice of that great bus driver turned baritone, Matt Monro. Do you agree? Disagree?
Matt, I have no opinion on singing bus drivers, even if they're called Matt.
I think that's a bit unfair on Monro.
But there were things about Grand Prix that blew me away. And that was mostly the use of car-mounted cameras, which we hadn't seen before. And there were split screens and multiple images and other bits of advanced cinematography. And they were all used quite brilliantly to convey speed and danger, which was the point of the whole thing. On the other hand, there were lots of things for the knowledgeable enthusiast to complain about. And I think it's fair to say that if you really want to enjoy Grand Prix, Matt, you have to take your anorak off first.
Ooh, tricky for me, but that's fair. I think that's fair. Anyway, I think a good place to start our look back is with John Frankenheimer himself, because by the mid-1960s, he'd established himself as one of Hollywood's leading directors, hadn't he, Richard?
Yes, and very quickly, too. He was still only in his mid-30s, but he'd already made The Birdman of Alcatraz with Burt Lancaster, The Manchurian Candidate with Frank Sinatra, and The Train with Lancaster again. So those three films, that was a prison drama, a psychological thriller, and a war movie. And they were all successful. So he was a hot property in Hollywood when he and his producer raised almost $10 million to make Grand Prix.
Which was a big sum in those days.
A lot of money. I mean, I think, they were using a lot of hardware, so it's not entirely surprising. But It was a big money. As for Frankenheimer himself, well, film directors often come across as control freaks, even dictators, because that's what they have to be. The best of them might be artists, but they're also in charge of an army, and not just of actors, but of all the camera and lighting and sound technicians and everybody that you see named in the credits. And Grand Prix had a huge cast and crew and a very complicated shooting schedule in a variety of locations where real life was taking place at the same time. In other words, Grand Prix racing at all these circuits around Europe. So it's not surprising that he could get a bit brusque and even sweary.
Yeah. It's just going back a second. It's interesting that you mention the movie The Train, Richard, because Frankenheimer said the idea to make Grand Prix came to him while he was in France making that film, making The Train. Although he's also been quoted as saying that his experiences as a club-level racing driver in his youth inspired him to make Grand Prix. Whichever is the truth. Do you know which is the truth?
I suspect the former is probably a bit more true than the club-level racing.
So do I, but anyway, I just thought I'd ask because you do know a little bit more, as will become clear over the next hour. You know a bit more about this subject than I do. Anyway, whichever is or was the truth, Frankenheimer pitched the idea for Grand Prix to MGM, the big studio, who liked what they heard and fronted up, as you say, considerable finance for the production. It was to be Frankenheimer's first really big budget production, and I think it was his first colour picture too, wasn't it?
I think so. I'm not absolutely sure about that.
Anyway, as you've already mentioned, Richard, Frankenheimer was a hugely ambitious filmmaker, and armed with megabucks from MGM, he went big with the production. We'll talk about the actors as we go along, but just to introduce some of them, he assembled a stellar cast, very much what's called an ensemble cast, in fact. James Garner, Eva Marie Saint, Yves Montand, Françoise Hardy, Brian Bedford, Genevieve Page. Do we pronounce her that way?
Page, I think, yes.
Yes, and we go with Genevieve, not Genevieve.
Yeah, if you like. Yeah.
Yes, Genevieve, of course, was a movie, but we'll talk about
Also
that another
Cars,
time. Also
yeah.
Cars.
Yeah.
Genevieve Page, Enzo Fiermonte, Rachel Kempson, let's not forget, and many, many more. And he filmed it not on a Hollywood film set, as you say, but on location at actual Grand Prix at Monaco, Spa, Zandvoort, Monza, Brands Hatch, and at another actual Grand Prix circuit, albeit not on a race weekend, Clermont-Ferrand. So you got authentic circuits with authentic Grand Prix watching crowds, which is obviously very important to the spectacle of the picture. And as I said earlier, authentic action spliced in with the fictional stuff.
He really wanted to ramp up the realism with Grand Prix, which makes you think that actually he was a fan of motor racing. He didn't just want to kind of busk it and make it, sort of fake it. He really wanted to make it look good. And previously, when people had been making these kind of action films based on motor racing, like The Racers in the 1950s or The Green Helmet earlier in the 60s, the director would use a lot of process shots, which is a bit like green screening, where you film a performance against a back projection, and it just looks fake.
Especially to modern eyes, it looks very fake
completely.
now.
I mean, it looks like a joke now. It's amazing what people put up with in the 50s.
I know.
So instead, for Grand Prix, Frankenheimer employed a bunch of innovative film techniques to take the viewer into the driver's seat and really capture the speed and excitement of Formula One racing at the time. And as you say, he was filming on real Grand Prix tracks, often during race weekends. And he employed real Grand Prix drivers, not just to provide cameos in the film, but to drive real cars, whether in front of or behind the camera. There were 20 real-life racers who drove in the film, either active drivers or recently retired ones, and they included Graham Hill, Jack Brabham, Richie Ginther, Jochen Rindt and Bruce McLaren. And there were some others like Juan Manuel Fangio, who didn't actually drive, but he was long retired by then, but appeared in various scenes. A lot of these guys were quite opposed to taking part at first, but Frankenheimer was clever at getting the US drivers on side first. Dan Gurney and Phil Hill and so on. Maybe they understood Hollywood a bit better. And they then helped to convince the Europeans that it would be a good idea to sign up to the project.
Money helped a little
I
bit.
think it probably did, yeah. Bob Bondurant, one of those American drivers, was hired as the movie's technical director and a driving double after he'd driven Frankenheimer around Willow Springs in California during the research phase. And along with Bondurant, Phil Hill and Chris Amon had yet to make a real impact in F1, he was still very young, were given the job of driving specially adapted Ford GT40 camera cars. They had giant film cameras attached to the front of them, and they were sometimes used to tow the cars, driven by the drivers, to create a kind of sled with the cameras pointing backwards. Frankenheimer really didn't want to film cars pootling around at slow speed and then speed the film up. He argued that viewers would be able to tell the difference between cars filmed like that with the footage speeded and cars being driven at actual race pace. He wanted the bespoke race scenes to look as realistic as the actual race footage that was also used in the film. And these faked scenes were shot either before, after, or during breaks in the actual Grand Prix action going on at these events.
And I think they were pretty effective, weren't they?
They were. They were mostly. At Brands Hatch, for example, they were given exactly 27 minutes before the race in which to use the track. That made the production quite stressful. There weren't any second chances to capture stuff, but that's mainly what enabled Grand Prix to stand the test of time. Mind you, at the time, a few of the more experienced journalists covering Formula One regularly were understandably pretty cynical about the Hollywood invasion. The great Henry Manny of Road and Track in America wrote about how the pits were suddenly full of Hollywood types, scuttling little men with walkie-talkies, movie cameramen underfoot everywhere, makeup ladies, strutting actors with fake grease marks on their faces, and the usual collection of camp followers.
Well, I never met Henry Manny, so that was your impersonation of him, wasn't it?
Give over. Now, motorsport's Dennis Jenkinson, who I'm sure Matt would agree was the purist's purist, and whom neither of us is going to attempt to imitate.
True.
Far too much respect. Spent most of the season complaining about what he called the comic opera stuff. He thought it was all a terrible distraction, and he claimed it was at least partially to blame when 7 cars crashed out in the rain on the first lap of the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa. He wrote that, quote, the overcrowding and confusion caused a lot of people to become very irritable and undoubtedly took the fine edge off their concentration.
Yes. I think the purist's purist, which you've just said about DSJ, I think it's a very fair description of DSJ, Dennis Jenkinson, Jenks, the self-styled continental correspondent of Motorsport magazine, for whose website, by the way, I write a weekly column. And I'm not at all surprised to hear that he wasn't at all keen on Hollywood's Formula One incursion.
Indeed, chaps like Manny and Jenks felt that the sport they cared so much about was in danger of being trivialized. But whatever they thought about it, they weren't in any doubt about the amount of trouble the Hollywood people were taking. Frankenheimer himself recalled, when I look back, I don't know how the hell we ever did that film. We were always shooting, usually where we weren't wanted, and usually with everything out of our control. But we just had to get those crowds. It's even said that he wanted to field his own fully fledged F1 team at each event so that he could get the shots he wanted. In those days, of course, unlike today, if you had an F1 car, you could just turn up and race it. But costs put paid to that idea. So instead, they built replica F1 cars with fake exhausts and so on, based around cars from smaller formulas, F2, F3, even Formula Junior. They weren't authentic, but your average viewer would be hard-pressed to notice the difference. And in addition, Frankenheimer bought, leased or borrowed some other proper F1 cars, including a Lotus and a BRM. Sometimes they were painted red to resemble Ferraris, particularly when the real Ferrari team didn't turn up for the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch because there was a metalworkers' strike in Italy.
That was the reason, was it?
That was the reason he gave.
There you go.
Enzo Ferrari. Yeah.
So, as we say, Frankenheimer really wanted to ramp up the realism in the visuals, and he did. And the same could be said for what he was aiming for with the story, and we'll discuss whether he achieved that shortly. The screenplay was credited to a chap called Robert Alan Arthur. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Arthur, I think.
Arthur. I was going to say, if you pronounce it Arthur, what a great surname for a screenwriter. Anyway, Robert Alan Arthur, he had already collaborated with Frankenheimer on various TV projects. Although Frankenheimer himself was very much involved in the scripting, and much of the dialogue was eventually reworked, I think, uncredited, by a novelist and playwright named Bill Hanley. And I know you've told me to take my anorak off, Richard, but that's a pretty decent anorak fact, I think you'll concede. Anyway, the screenplay lent heavily on the American writer Robert Daly's book The Cruel Sport, which was first published in 1963, and it highlighted, to some people, in a too sensationalist way, how Grand Prix drivers, Formula One drivers, competed against one another with the ever-present spectre of death hanging over them. And death and danger do indeed loom large in the plot of Grand Prix, don't they, Richard?
Yeah, and they certainly did at the time. Actually, I thought, and I still think, that The Cruel Sport was a great book. Robert Daly was a wonderful writer, and he went a lot deeper into the way drivers thought than most of his colleagues. There wasn't a lot about gear ratios, or valve clearances in the book. In fact, nothing. But there was a lot about how drivers approached the job and their fears and reservations about it, as well as the pleasures of it. But if the film had a tendency towards sensationalism, that was hardly a surprise. This was Hollywood, after all. And the story follows the fortunes of several drivers and the women who they're connected with through a fictionalised version of the 1966 season. One thing that's always struck me about Grand Prix is that it can be seen not just as a film about motor racing, but as a film about the relationships between the drivers and the women who love and live with them, and how their lives are impacted by the ever-present danger of racing. Yes, it can get a bit soap opera-ish, but to me it's there that the best of the script writing can be found.
Well, yes, I agree that the romantic dialogue is actually often very good. Perhaps surprisingly subtle for what's, au fond, a movie about racing. But even so, I think, and you may disagree, how can I put this, the women decorate the movie rather than genuinely co-star in it. Unfair?
We'll come to that a bit later, maybe.
I'm not criticising their performances at all.
I think they play an equal part in the film, but...
That's an interesting point. And look, having said that, I can't really think of a way in which Frankenheimer could have incorporated women other than as wags, wives and girlfriends.
Very reductive term you've used.
Yeah, I know, and not a term. The term wag was not used, obviously, in 1966, of course. But let's face it, it's just a fact. The only women to be found anywhere in Formula One in the 1960s were indeed wives and girlfriends, really. Mm-hmm. So I suppose it's inevitable. Anyway, there are four principal drivers whose fortunes the movie's narrative follows. The first is Pete Aaron, an American who has a reputation for being quick but reckless, played by James Garner. And actually, I don't think he was at all well cast. First of all, Garner, he didn't really look like a Formula One driver, in my opinion. He was far too tall, 6'3", and far too stocky too. He was a big guy. Actually, he didn't really look like a sportsman at all. He looked more like a private detective. Maybe he should have played one instead. Oh, silly me. He did. Do you remember the Rockford Files?
Certainly do.
He was well cast in that as Jim Rockford, but as I say, he wasn't, in my view, well cast in Grand Prix. And as it happens, he wasn't actually the first choice for the role, was he, Richard?
No, he certainly wasn't. Frankenheimer wanted Steve McQueen, who was being lined up until he had a meeting with the producer, Ed Lewis, and fell out with him on the spot and walked out. So James Garner was brought in to play Pete Aaron against Frankenheimer's wishes. And whatever your fond memories of the Rockford Files in the 70s, Garner didn't bring a lot of depth to a part. McQueen would have made Pete Aaron more moody and complex and compelling, much more of an enigma, which would have added a whole other dimension to the film.
I absolutely agree with you. Garner was I don't want to have a downer on Garner, but he was just too smooth a dude to play a Formula One driver who was, let's not forget, supposed to be quick but reckless.
Kind of bland, I think.
Bland. Yeah. Bland, polished, all those things. McQueen was handsome too, by the way, very handsome, but in a far more rugged way. And by the way, he was 5'9", not 6'3". Yes, I mean, McQueen would have been much, much better.
Well, McQueen, as we know, is a very decent racing driver in real life. But to be fair, James Garner was also pretty good behind the wheel. Bob Bondurant said James was a great natural driver. He listened and he took direction very well. And Bondurant ran a very good racing school in the States at the time, so he knew what he was talking about. Frankenheimer reckoned that Garner could have made it as a pro if he'd taken it up sooner. I don't know what the standards of pro driving were like in America at the time, but maybe
well,
he could.
I suppose, just to finish off on this business, I mean, 6'3" and big and stocky and American, I mean, he could have been a NASCAR driver in the 60s, couldn't
yes,
he?
He could indeed.
He could have indeed. Yeah.
Frankenheimer wanted all of the main actors to drive for real, or at the very least to be pulled along by the GT40 sled thingy. And Garner drove a lot of his own scenes and really impressed the real-life Grand Prix drivers, who were initially pretty nervous about sharing the track with amateurs. Especially, they were impressed when he drove at 140 mile an hour at Spa in the wet.
Fair dues, actually, that is.
Yep. And as it happened, McQueen and Warner Brothers, his studio, ended up working on their own racing film, which was going to be called Day of the Champion, which led to a couple of things. First, the Nürburgring not featuring in Frankenheimer's Grand Prix, as the McQueen film had exclusive rights to the German track. And second, the production of Grand Prix was hurried along to beat off the competition. And to give you an idea of the timeline, filming began in May 1966 and finished in early October, with the film being released in the US just before Christmas. For a very complex production, that was an extraordinarily tight schedule.
Yes, that is extraordinary. Amazing. Anyway, the next principal driver we should mention, Scott Stoddard, is played by Brian Bedford, who was referred to as English throughout the film, but who wore a helmet featuring Jackie Stewart's famous tartan stripe. He was based, said Frankenheimer, on Sterling Moss, although he drove Stewart's BRM, or Jordan BRM, as it was called in the movie, and to my eyes, to confuse matters further, he looked rather like Jim Clark.
Yep. Indeed.
You agree?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. As such, in my view, Bedford very much looked the part. I mean, if you look like Jim Clark, you look like a Formula One driver, let's face it. And to continue my obsession with height, he was 5'8" and wiry. And actually, I think his performance was one of the movie's understated highlights. He played a tortured soul very subtly.
Yeah, he was tortured by comparisons with his brother, wasn't he? His older brother, Roger, who'd been world champion in 1958 in, rather mystifyingly, a Lotus 16. But there we go. Sorry, continue.
Nice anorak fact as well. But that was one of the things that tortured his soul. But also he was tortured by, bad injuries in the film, unlucky in love or troubled in love. All these things tortured his soul, and I think he played that very well. And there might have been a temptation for him to shout and scream, I suppose, to overact, in fact, given all his character's trials and tribulations. But instead, he played it all in a very measured but poignant way. Bedford gave a great performance as Stoddart, I reckon.
Yeah, agreed. Very sensitive performance. Probably the most sensitive in the film, I should think.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think Frankenheimer could really have based him on Moss, because he was nothing like him in any respect, on or off the track. For a start, Bedford only had a driving license a few months before filming started. And after being given a bit of coaching in how to drive racing cars, he decided very quickly that it wasn't for him.
Right.
Either double me or replace me, he's said to have told Frankenheimer. And that's why, apparently, in the racing scenes, Stoddart's character always has his mask pulled up over his face.
Great. I'm glad that did happen because, as I say, I thought Bedford was a great addition, a great part of the film.
And actually, for those scenes where the camera is looking back at the drivers' faces as they're racing, those were filmed using the GT40 sled contraption we mentioned earlier. So Frankenheimer could capture the speed and maybe even a look of genuine concentration and fear in the actors' faces. Chris Amon, who was driving one of the GT40s, gave an interview to the journalist Dylan Michael about towing the actors around. He said, "I got the distinct impression Frankenheimer didn't like Sabato." That's Antonio Sabato, the actor playing Nino Barlini, who we'll talk about in a bit. And when he put him in the trailer hitch, he'd be doing some scenes and Frankenheimer would say, "Hang it out a bit." And you knew you could hang the GT40 out and it would hang the trailer out into the ditch, basically.
Very tormenting of the poor actor.
Just a way of getting sort of different kind of method acting, really, isn't it?
Exactly,
Trying to
yes.
kind of get a reaction. But Yves Montand, who played the driver Jean-Pierre Sarti, Barlini's teammate, did a lot in that trailer car too, and it was interesting to watch him work. You could see
this is still
this is Eamon talking.
Eamon talking.
Yeah.
Yes, go on.
Yeah. You could see it must have been bloody terrifying. You could see it was bothering him, but then he'd pull himself together and act again. So very professional. I wouldn't have wanted to sit in that thing for all the money in the world.
No, indeed. But anyway, going back to the drivers, you mentioned Jean-Pierre Sarti, played by Yves Montand. And he was also inspired by a real-life driver, or in this case, drivers, plural, an amalgam of Juan Manuel Fangio, Wolfgang von Trips, and Jean Berrat, according to Frankenheimer. And I'm probably going to be accused by our listeners, and perhaps even by you here and now, dear Richard, of cinematic sacrilege, because I don't think Montand was particularly well cast either.
Zut alors, merde!
Sacrilege. Yes, I realise he was supposed to be playing an older driver, and Fangio is the driver whom he clearly brings to the viewer's mind, I believe, more than Berra, and certainly more than Von Trips. But again, he didn't look the part, in my opinion. He was 45 in 1966 and, like Garner, too tall. He was 6'2". I think Montand looked like, how can I put this? I think he looked like a successful dress designer, not a seasoned Formula One driver. You know, I'd like to have seen someone like Alain Delon, recently died, of course, Alain Delon in the part. Delon would have been 31 in 1966. Sorry, and a sensible height, 5'10". And I'll stop talking about height in a little while, but
all the Formula One teams you've worked for, Matt, do they all cast their drivers by height?
Well, I talked about this with Ron Dennis, 6'1", and no, I'm joking. Anyway,
continue.
Alain Delon, 31 in 1966, 5'10". Perfect. And by the way, I think, and look the part, I think you'll concede, I think he would have added more to the movie than would have been lost by the removal of the older driver element, in my opinion. Obviously subject to disagreement, but that's in my opinion. Let me ask you, or put it to you this way. Imagine Steve McQueen and Alain Delon instead of James Garner and Yves Montand. That would have been box office dynamite and more interesting chemistry, I think. What do you reckon?
Well, Alain Delon, he was one of Enzo Ferrari's customers. In 1960, he bought a black California Spider 250 that might have been the most beautiful car ever made, actually, if you ask me. And it went for 16 million euros at auction in 2015, which I think was a bit underpriced.
If only you'd known, you might have bid.
I'd have saved up from the age of 10. Anyway, as the last main driver character, Nino Barlini, the young Sicilian played by Antonio Sabato in just his second ever film, he wore the helmet of another charismatic young Italian, Lorenzo Bandini. And if you think Barlini sounds like Bandini, and Aaron sounds like Eamon, and Sarti like Surtees, and so on, that was absolutely deliberate. It was so that, at a glance, audiences wouldn't notice the wrong name written on the side of one of the real cars in the genuine footage, and they all had their names on labels on the side of the cars in those days.
Isn't that interesting? I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Anyway, my last bit of anorak factdom, or whatever you call it at the moment. Like Bedford, I think Sabato looked the part. In fact, I think he looked a bit like François Savert. And he was 5'10". Sorry. He was 5'10". Since as I say, I do appear to be fixating on the fact that Garner and Montan were both ludicrously tall. Anyway, alongside the cast of male actors playing the drivers, we have a fabulous cast of female stars whose heights I am not aware of. So 2 Americans, Eva Marie Saint as American magazine writer Louise Fredrickson, who plays Sarti's love interest, and Jessica Walter as Scott Stoddard's unhappy wife Pam, a former model, and 2 French actresses, the singer Françoise Hardy as Lisa, Barlini's love interest, and Geneviève Page as Sarti's semi-detached wife, Monique, a chic and successful businesswoman. Do you think they were well cast, Richard?
Well, I'd say more convincing than the men, mostly. Eva Marie Saint was already famous for On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando, and for Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest with Cary Grant. And Jessica Walter would become famous in 1971 when she played a psychotic stalker opposite Clint Eastwood in Play Misty for Me. That was a great movie.
Great movie.
Geneviève Page was a great French stage and film actress who'd starred with Charlton Heston and Sophia Loren in El Cid, a rather different kind of epic. I guess in terms of acting talent, the exception was Françoise Hardy, who clearly wasn't an actress at all. She was a singer. Although I've never heard anyone actually complain about her presence in the movie, and certainly not me.
Indeed. And that feels like a good time to head for a quick break.
You saw that play when your QB dropped back, looked off the safety, and threw a dime deep for the go-ahead touchdown. That's not just hall-worthy, that's wall-worthy, and you can own a piece of it when you shop the unrivaled selection of trading cards and memorabilia on eBay, the home of collectibles since 1995. Huddle up with 132 million users around the world to find that rookie patch auto you can't find anywhere else. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Plus, with eBay Authenticity Guarantee for trading cards, you know that what you buy is the real deal. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's right, your collecting journey kicks off right here, right now at ebay.com/theathletic. Come through and collect with us today.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Playoff baseball is back. I'm Derek Van Riper, host of the Athletics Rates and Barrels podcast. Join Eno Saris,
Mr. Stats Guy,
Britt Chiroli,
how you like them apples,
Trevor May, and I as we dig deep into the key matchups and advanced stats driving the critical decisions throughout the postseason. From the first crack of the bat in the wild card round until the last pitch of the World Series, we have you covered. Check out the Rates and Barrels podcast every day during the postseason, wherever you get your podcasts.
So let's talk about the movie itself and some of its most memorable and notable scenes. As you've mentioned, Richard, it clocks in at around the 3-hour mark, so it's not short. In fact, it's a bit too long in my view. And if you haven't watched it before, there are going to be plenty of spoilers from here on in, so please do bear that in mind. But anyway, it starts with a bang, doesn't it? as we're thrown straight into the action at Monaco, which is great stuff.
Yes, it is. After a very compelling and noisy opening, lots of engine noise, we're thrown onto the grid at Monaco and then straight into the race action. And we get several amazing minutes of footage, including a low-level onboard camera mounted on a Lotus driven by Phil Hill in practice. And that is unobstructed by anything like dialogue or plot or any of that rubbish.
It's
just
great
straight
stuff.
on
It's
racing.
really stirring stuff.
It is. Phil Hill, who'd retired from F1 3 years earlier, also gave us some great onboard shots of Spa later in the film, driving one of the first McLarens. But anyway, back to Monaco, where Scott Stoddart's Jordan BRM is leading from Jean-Pierre Sarti's Ferrari. Pete Aaron is third in the other BRM, but he develops gearbox problems, and when Stoddart comes up to lap him out of the tunnel, Aaron's car slows and the two teammates collide very spectacularly. Aaron's car is launched into the harbour and Stoddart has a massive crash at the chicane and is badly injured. These were incredible special effects for the time, in the era before computer-generated images. But they did take some time to get right, and if you watch the little making-of documentary, you'll see that Garner and Frankenheimer nearly came to blows with some of the frustrated locals while filming in Monaco.
Yes, and if I may say so, here's an anorak fact relating to Aaron's shunt. 2 drivers have actually crashed their cars at the harbour chicane and into the Mediterranean, in Grand Prix in real life. Alberto Ascari in a Lancia in 1955, just 4 days before he was killed testing at Monza, and Paul Hawkins in a Lotus in 1965. And that surely influenced the plot point in the movie.
Couldn't happen today. If you went off at the harbour in a Formula One car, now you'd end up on the deck of a super yacht.
You would, absolutely, next to an oligarch.
Yep.
And his entourage. Anyway, they were amazing effects, as you say, Richard, and they were achieved using some very interesting methods. For example, I'm sure you already knew this, but a hydrogen cannon was used to fire Stoddart's car up in the air and against the stone wall. Yep, an anorak fact. And the rather eerie footnote to that particular crash scene is that just a year later, Lorenzo Bandini, real-life Formula One driver, of course, was fatally injured in exactly the same place, 1967 Monaco Grand Prix, exactly the same place as the fictional crash had occurred. And not only that, but he, Bandini, had helped stage the crash for the movie.
Yeah, a very sad thought. As it happens, I saw Bandini's widow, Margherita, at a function in Italy this summer. She's into her 80s now, and she's still very elegantly keeping his memory alive.
Yes, yes.
What the film also captures is the complete lack of proper safety procedures in place after such an accident in those days. So you see a marshal with a whistle directing a medical crew, including nurses, across a live circuit to get to Stoddart as the race is still going on around them. Anyway, after the crash, Garner's character Aaron is sacked, rather comically, by Jeff Jordan, the boss of the Jordan BRM team, and ends up going cap in hand to Ferrari to ask for a drive. Enzo Ferrari had actually initially refused to let his cars or even his name appear in the film. But after John Frankenheimer had shown him an hour's worth of early footage from Monaco, Enzo was convinced to give his permission and even to allow filming in the Ferrari factory. So we get these wonderful shots of James Garner walking through the gates at Maranello and then through the workshop as he talks to the Enzo Ferrari figure, who's played by Adolfo Celli, who does a much more convincing job than Adam Driver in the recent Ferrari biopic. What do you think of those scenes, Matt?
Well, first of all, I absolutely agree with you that Adolfo Celli played Enzo Ferrari far better in 1966 than Adam Driver did in 2023. And yes, the scenes shot at Maranello in Grand Prix are authentic and cool. It's funny, isn't it? Ferrari embraced Hollywood in 1966, but Ferrari refused to play ball with Netflix for the first season of Drive to Survive in 2019, as did Mercedes, actually. Those two teams didn't take part. They do now, but they didn't in season 1. Perhaps Ferrari were in some ways more enlightened under Enzo Ferrari than they were under the likes of Marco Mattiacci, Maurizio Arrivabene, Mattia Binotto, etc. But that's definitely another podcast. But it's an interesting, to me, an interesting detail. Anyway, going back to Grand Prix, there's a line from Celli's character, Manetti, in those scenes with Pete Aaron, where he says, quote, "What means far more to me than anything else is our good name. Our reputation represents desire for perfection of the highest quality. I gamble that reputation gladly because I have absolute faith in every car that leaves this factory. But I will not risk it on a driver in whom I cannot have an equal faith. There are fewer than 30 men in the world qualified to drive in Formula One, a mere half dozen perhaps to win. At this moment, I am inclined to think that you are not one of them." That's quite nice and quite Enzo Ferrari-like, I think. And while we're quoting lines from the film, Richard, what's your favourite?
That's easy, and it's nothing to do with motor racing. It's the short nightclub scene in which Nino Barlini spots the beautiful Lisa, played by Françoise Hardy, and goes up to her. "Dance?" he says. "I don't dance," she replies. "Have a drink on me." "I don't drink." "Smoke?" "I don't smoke." "What do you do?" And she turns and looks him in the eye.
That's a great scene, isn't it?
It is. They play it better than I just did.
You
Anyway,
didn't do too badly. I mean, your Françoise Hardy...
better than my Nino Barlini.
Yeah, you made her rather a bit of a baritone, I would say.
Well, okay. And there are some other good scenes, like when Mr. Yamura, a Japanese team boss played by the great actor Toshiro Mifune, tells Pete Aaron how many American planes he shot down during the war, and he watches Aaron's face for a reaction.
That's a very good scene. And by the way, I do agree, Toshiro Mifune plays it very well, doesn't he?
It's terrific.
Terrific. Anyway, as you mentioned, Adolfo Celli is very good in his Enzo Ferrari-like role, but perhaps not quite as good on the acting front is Graham Hill, real-time Formula One driver, Damon Hill's father, who appears quite a lot and even has a line of dialogue. And I find that very surprising because actually Graham Hill was a wonderfully sardonic raconteur, a brilliant after-dinner speaker, a real wag, in fact. And I'm using that word in its original meaning to denote a very witty person, not a wife and girlfriend. Yet he, Graham Hill, makes a remarkably wooden actor, doesn't he?
Yeah, Graham's a bit more Terry Thomas than Leslie Phillips, if you'll pardon the period reference, when he's given a couple of lines at a victory party. He goes over to Sarti and he says, "That was an excellent race you did today, Jean-Pierre. Well done. Very good." Not exactly Olivier, but anyway, he's a world champion. So, according to an article by Richard Hesseltine in Motorsport magazine, Graham had actually been vehemently against cars carrying bulky cameras being allowed in the races proper, as were several other members of the Grand Prix Drivers Association. However, they conveniently forgot the GPDA's blanket ban on the use of in-car cameras during races on learning of MGM's massive budget for the film. Their change of heart actually disgusted the 1964 world champion John Surtees to the point that he resigned from the organisation.
Wow.
But if Graham's line was one of the movie's dramatic low points, the cinematography provides undoubted highs. As we mentioned earlier, Matt, no expense was spared. Frankenheimer was reunited for this film with the cinematographer Lionel Linden, who'd won an Oscar for Around the World in 80 Days. And together, they actually co-opted all of the state-of-the-art 70mm cameras in existence at the time.
My goodness.
And they experimented with lots of different camera mounts and angles and created a new type of camera rig that could be fitted to the side of the cars. And that's what gives us all those wonderful onboard camera shots. They actually tried damping the camera mountings so that they wouldn't shake so much. But they discovered when they looked at the footage, they're actually undamped, shaking around, looked much more realistic, which it was.
Yeah.
So they stuck with that.
And much more dramatic, I'm sure,
Much
as well.
more dramatic,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So they weren't actually able to film at the French Grand Prix at Reims, so they set up their own French Grand Prix at Clermont-Ferrand, which was a Grand Prix circuit, bussing in 3,000 extras to form the crowd. But that gave them a bit more time to try some different things with the action shots, and you get some really great sequences shot in France, where through the use of long lenses, you get an almost slow-motion, rather balletic effect at times.
Yeah,
as the cars go by.
That's great footage, that
It
stuff.
is, yeah. Then you had all the multi-screen effects created by Saul Bass, an Oscar-winning genius who designed the famous title sequences for Anatomy of a Murder, Vertigo, and Psycho.
Alfred Hitchcock movies.
Alfred Hitchcock, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also what I think of as one of the great shots of cinema. We're at Spa, and the race is starting, and everybody's worried about the threat of rain, which is often what happens at Spa. In the Ardennes, there's always a bit of rain.
I wouldn't say
that.
the threat of rain, I'd say the certitude. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of laps in, the screen is filled with a close-up of a proper old-fashioned analog stopwatch being held by someone in the pits. We don't see who it is, it doesn't matter. But suddenly a raindrop lands on the glass of the stopwatch, and we know instantly that trouble is coming.
Yes. Look, the Belgian Grand Prix segment of Grand Prix is a really interesting one, I think, actually, because if you recall, in the real race, footage of which was used extensively in the film, more than half the field crashed out on lap 1, owing to that exact heavy rain that you've just described. And Phil Hill's camera car captured a lot of the carnage. And with the helicopter shots, we see Joe Bonnier's Cooper Maserati perched on a parapet, its front half in the air, and other cars off the road. And remember, this was also the race in which Jackie Stewart crashed his BRM into a telegraph pole, then landed in a ditch beside the Master Kink, causing him to be stuck upside down, up to his waist, in fuel for 25 minutes before he was rescued by Graham Hill and Bob Bondurant, who'd both crashed nearby.
Yeah, that's an area in which the film does a very valuable historical job because it gives a really vivid impression of what the risks were like for the drivers in that era.
Absolutely. And also in the Belgian Grand Prix bit of the film, we have the grim scene in which Sarti's Ferrari leaves the road and crashes, killing 2 young spectators. And that drama is quickly followed by shots of Pete Aaron crossing the line and winning, and all the victory celebrations. And, you know, however hammed up some of all that may look to modern eyes, that kind of thing really did happen at the time. You did have spectators killed by crashing cars, and races did then still go on, and people did then still celebrate, unaware of what had happened elsewhere on the track. So that too is a decent reflection of the period. I mean, as a little aside, I've just written a column that includes Clay Regazzoni's description of the 1967 Formula 3 race at Caserta, which obviously took place the year after Grand Prix was made in 1966. And in that race, Formula 3 race at Caserta, not 1, not 2, but 3 drivers were killed in a multi-car shunt. I'll name them: Beat Fehr, Romano Perdoni, and Giacomo Rosso. That kind of tragedy was not that uncommon in those days.
In the film, we're shown the 2 boys watching the race from a prohibited area. And then we see the anger of their father, who manages to find his way into the Ferrari garage to confront the driver, Sarti. That certainly didn't happen in the real race, nothing like it. But it's obviously a transposition of the tragic crash during the 1957 Mille Miglia sports car race, when Alfonso de Portago's Ferrari killed 9 people, including 5 children, plus himself and the co-driver.
Dreadful, absolutely dreadful. But anyway, going back to the movie, James Garner's character Pete Aaron wins that race at Spa, as I say, and by that point, he's driving a Yamara car. Toshiro Mifune, we've mentioned, who was known to European audiences as the star of Seven Samurai, played the Japanese industrialist Izo Yamura, who is obviously meant to be Soichiro Honda. And indeed, the Yamura cars use a colour scheme that's very clearly like those of the Hondas that had raced in Formula One in 1965 and actually were about to make a return. However, the Yamuras featured in the real racing footage from the film weren't Hondas. In fact, the producers struck a deal with Bruce McLaren's newly formed McLaren team to have his car, the McLaren M2B, painted in the Yamura team's colour scheme. Anorak fact. On 2 occasions, when McLaren wasn't on the grid, another car was painted in the same colours. Bob Bondurant's BRM at Spa and Mike Spence's Lotus at Zandvoort. I think you'll have to agree, another Anorak fact.
Frankenheimer went to great lengths to make it all seem authentic. The fake Yamura was actually a disguised Formula 3 car. And as Garner said, when he realised my car didn't have enough torque to spin its wheels, he coated the tyres with oil to make it smoke like the real thing. And that brings us to another memorable scene, which is when Pete Aaron's car bursts into flames as he crosses the finish line to finish second at Brands Hatch. The film did have stuntmen. One of them was a guy called Max Balchowski, who'd been a belly gunner in B-24 bombers in the war, and I remember him from American magazines as racing a famous hot rod called Old Yeller. And another of the stunt team was Carey Loftin, who worked on those famous car chase sequences in Vanishing Point, The French Connection, and Bullet.
Great movies.
Yeah.
Great movies for petrol heads.
They certainly were. Garner, though, actually performed that Brands Hatch stunt himself, according to him, because the stuntman couldn't make it in time. The car was supposed to catch fire, so it was rigged with butane bottles, and Garner had to open the tap to make it catch fire in a controlled manner. But the fire ended up being a lot bigger than expected. I think one of the tanks exploded. So when he goes to a halt and jumps out of the car, it's for real. There's a lot of realism there. And he said that Lloyd's of London, after that, actually cancelled his insurance policy. And for the rest of the picture, he had to drive without insurance.
Is it actually an slightly earlier version of, "You were only supposed to blow the bloody doors off"?
Like that.
Anyway, it's a great scene and it looks very authentic. And it leads in nicely to the final section of the film I'd like to talk about, which is the dramatic Monza finale. Now, the first thing to say is that Monza looks absolutely fantastic in those sequences, I think. Although, if you're a racing aficionado, Anorak, you'll immediately notice one distinct break from reality. Grand Prix's Italian Grand Prix has the drivers racing on the famous banked section of the track, the banking, when in reality it was last raced on by Formula One cars in 1961. And that date, 1961, is an interesting one because we've mentioned Phil Hill in this podcast as one of the real Formula One drivers who drove camera cars and as an inspiration for Garner's character Pete Aaron. And actually, there's a line spoken by Montan's character Sati earlier in the film, which is a direct quote from Phil Hill in the Robert Daly book we mentioned earlier. Sati is talking about how he used to want to stop the car and walk away when he saw a bad accident, but now, quote, "When I see something really horrible, I put my foot down, hard, because I know that everyone else is lifting his." It's a great quote.
One of the great quotes. It's like Daley Thompson's quote about he always trained on Christmas Day because he knew that nobody else was.
Brilliant quote.
A great sporting quote.
But this final part of the film has obvious parallels with the 1961 Italian Grand Prix, which Phil Hill won, and after which he was crowned Formula One world champion, but, albeit, in terrible circumstances.
Yes, and spoiler alert, in this final segment of the film, the dramatic tension is ramped up as Aaron, Barlini, Stoddart and Sati all go into the final race competing for the title. As you say, this to some extent mirrors 1961, when Hill and his Ferrari teammate, Wolfgang von Trips, went into Monza vying for the title. Von Trips suffered a horrible fate when his car crashed into the wire fence holding back the crowd, killing himself and 15 spectators, and forever staining Hill's moment of glory as the first American world champion. And in this final segment of the film, one of our characters meets a similarly grim end. Before that happens, we get some action sequences on the banking and some commentary from the drivers on what it's like to drive the cars and deal with danger. And each of them is trying to answer the question of why they choose to live with such risk. All of which seems perfectly plausible to me, very well written, dramatic but not melodramatic.
I think that's a good way of describing it. Dramatic but not melodramatic. But as an aside, if I may say so, isn't it strange and sad that the only two drivers from this is in real life now again, the only two drivers from the United States ever to win the Formula One World Championship, Phil Hill in 1961 and Mario Andretti in 1978, both did so at Monza, and in both cases their teammate and World Championship rival lost his life. Wolfgang von Trips in 1961 and Ronnie Peterson in 1978. Sad and strange, as I say. Don't you agree?
Yes, Count von Trips and Super Swede.
Exactly.
Always something to contemplate when you visit Monza. The tragedy as well as the glory of the place. Completely.
And a strange mirror image of those two American drivers' successes. Yeah. Anyway, going back to the scenes on the banking in the movie that you mentioned, again, there's a nice quote from James Garner talking about filming those in a motorsport magazine article from 2000, the year 2000. Garner was speaking to the journalist Andrew Frankel. Garner said, quote, "I was on the banking here at Monza doing a sequence with Phil Hill, and we'd be driving at 130 or 140 miles per hour, and Phil's car kept on slowing and then getting faster. When we got to the pits, I asked him to keep to a steady speed, and he replied, 'It wasn't me changing speed, it was you slipstreaming me.'" And Garner adds, "I'd never heard of slipstreaming until then."
Ah, slipstreaming. That's a reminder of the days before wings and DRS zones and chicanes, when Monza was a slipstreaming paradise.
Exactly.
4 cars abreast, 6 cars abreast.
Yeah, and wonderful. 50 lead changes in a race.
Yep. But back to the film, the real life of the film, and the final race of the season in which everything is at stake. Sarti stalls at the start and he's forced to battle his way back through the field as Aaron, Barlini and Stoddart fight for the lead. Sarti's up to 4th when he comes up to lap a group of back markers on the banking, and the exhaust pipe on one of their cars falls directly into the path of his Ferrari. This sends him skewing up the banking and over the lip, and his car hits a tree before landing and exploding in flames. Nobody was wearing seatbelts then, of course, so Sarti is tossed out and his body hits a tree too. It's a pretty gruesome death, and it's been criticised as being a bit cartoonish.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sarti kind of hangs like a rag doll, doesn't he?
Yes, but, that could have happened.
I'm not criticising it, I'm just saying it's quite a affecting scene.
Yeah, I mean, as you and I both know, the banking is still there. There have been moves to demolish it, but they've left it there, thank goodness, although nobody's raced on it since the 60s. It's not only very steep, I tried to climb up it once and failed. I was wearing leather-soled shoes, which didn't help. But it's also very bumpy, and that's why F1 cars stopped racing on it. And it makes it quite plausible that something like an exhaust pipe might have been shaken loose. And, as we've been saying, drivers did meet grim and shocking deaths in those days.
Yeah. I actually tried to climb it once too, in 2015, with Kevin Magnussen, who was McLaren's, because I was working for McLaren at the time, our reserve driver at the time. I didn't quite make it to the top. I was 52 at the time, after all. I don't know if I was wearing leather leather-soled shoes, but I probably wasn't wearing the right shoes.
Well, I was dressed properly for a proper Grand Prix.
Yeah, you were wearing spats and a cravat. Anyway, I didn't quite make it to the top. probably not dressed for athleticism, and 52 at the time. But of course Kevin did. And, all drivers are very, very competitive. He certainly wasn't going to not make it to the top. He kind of ran up there like a gazelle. Anyway, going back to your point, which was that drivers did indeed die deaths as gruesome as Sarti's in Grand Prix. Yes, they certainly did. I mean, for instance, we've already mentioned once, I think, Jean Berrat, the legendary French driver, lost his life in not too dissimilar a fashion in 1959, didn't he? When his car went over the famous Arvus banking in Berlin. And after striking a flagpole, he too came down into trees.
Yes, but what happens next in the film probably wasn't so true to life. We get scenes of Sarti's body being returned to the paddock before Manetta, the Ferrari boss, walks to the pit wall and shows a black flag with a Ferrari emblem to Barlini, indicating that he should withdraw from the race. That seems a bit out of keeping with Ferrari. Enzo didn't withdraw Hill's car in 1961 when Von Trips was killed, although in the movie the race commentator does note, and it's true, that Alfa Romeo made a similar move to withdraw their cars when Antonio Ascari was killed during the 1925 French Grand Prix at Montlhéry, and that Alfa team was actually being run by Enzo Ferrari, even though he wasn't at that race.
It was indeed. And I agree. That scene didn't really ring true with me either. Very un-Enzo Ferrari-like, in my view. And don't forget what he, Enzo Ferrari, allegedly said when he was told that his driver, Eugenio Castellotti, had been killed testing a Ferrari at Modena in 1957. And the quote goes like this: Castellotti morte. Obviously, Castellotti dead. Then he added, E la macchina? And the car? Do you think that's true, by the way, Richard?
I've heard that from several fairly reputable sources. If it's not true, it ought to be.
Too good to check.
It is, yeah.
And impossible to check now anyway.
Very much.
So let's call it true. Yeah. Great story. And very Enzo Ferrari-like. Yeah. Anyway, back to Grand Prix. The Italian Grand Prix boiled down to a straight fight between Aaron and Stoddard. And in a super close finish, Aaron nicked the win and the World Championship victory on the line. But then, of course, as with Phil Hill in 1961, the post-race pageantry is hugely bittersweet. And that's how the film ends.
And that feels like a good time for our final break.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC. This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
When Grand Prix came out in late December 1966, it's fair to say that it received fairly mixed reviews. So I'm going to read you a section of what the New York Times wrote. Quote, Mr. Frankenheimer belts you with such a barrage of magnificent shots of the racing cars, seen from every angle and every possible point of intimacy, that you really feel as though you've been in it after you've seen this film. Furthermore, the director and Saul Bass, do you call him Bass? Bass. Saul Bass, and he was the visual consultant in charge of titles, fill that mammoth screen from time to time with multiple graphics and montages that look like movies at a World's Fair. This is still the New York Times, by the way. Triple and quadruple panels and even screen-filling checkerboards full of appropriate and expressive racing world images hit the viewer with stimulations that optically generate a sort of intoxication with racing. It's razzle-dazzle of a random sort, but it works. The big trouble with this picture is that the characters and their romantic problems are stereotypes and cliches. So, this is me again now. So heavy praise for the visuals and the racing sequences, but criticism of the characters and indeed the script. Do you think that's fair, Richard? Because I kind of have to say that I do.
Well, it's not Drive to Survive with a script by Shakespeare or even Harold Pinter, but it's basically sympathetic to the sport. It has a decent grasp of the sport's complexities and contradictions, and it does its best to portray it as it was at the time, both its good and bad sides. And it took $20 million at the box office, which is twice what it cost to make.
Yes,
That was healthy.
I don't want to be churlish, but and yes, the racing footage is superb, obviously. And as you say, the plot and the screenplay aren't naive to the subtleties of Formula One skullduggery and politics, and all of that is interesting and exciting. But if I can call it this, but the rom-com bits are as dull as ditchwater, in my opinion. Sorry. It's nearly 3 hours long. I'd be very interested to see a version that was cut by 45 minutes. I think it would be tighter, tauter, pacier, and better. Richard, I saw you making a slight face when I said rom-com.
Yeah, I'm going to come back at you on all that in a little while.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, that sounds ominous. Well, I'll say a few more things before you give me this well-heralded bollocking.
I'm just going to store it up for a minute and let it marinate.
Anyway, it so happens that quite a lot of people in the racing world didn't receive the movie especially well at the time. Here's Chris Amon's view, for example. Quote, "I guess the initial reaction, and not just from me, was that it was all a bit over the top. But to be bluntly honest, and I've watched it a number of times since, looking back, it was all pretty much as it was. Slightly embellished in what people were saying, in that I don't think we actually used to talk that way. But what the people were saying in the movie was what I guess people were thinking privately at the time. So in that regard, it was probably fairly close to the truth. But, as I say, we didn't tend to talk about it quite so much." That's Amon. Of course, Amon is talking about the racing bits, not the rom-com.
Well, he doesn't actually specify that, when he says what people were thinking privately. I mean, he may be talking about what you choose to call the rom-com bits. I would call the soap opera bits. Anyway, there we are.
Well, that's not much more complimentary than the rom-com bits. Anyway, perhaps I think Eamon was talking about the racing bits, but he may have been talking about the rom-com or soap opera bits as well. Even so, if Frankenheimer was shooting for reality, which he absolutely was, then as far as the racing bits are concerned, that's pretty decent praise from Eamon,
yes,
from a man who really should know, did know.
Yep.
So I should say at this point that not only did the movie more than recoup the money that was spent on it, as you say, Richard, but it also won 3 Academy Awards, 3 Oscars, for Best Sound Effects, and Best Editing.
Yeah, technical awards, not for acting or script, which are the famous
indeed. So I don't think Graham Hill was actually even nominated for Best Supporting Actor.
Best Supporting former world champion.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, in the whole, the movie itself, Grand Prix, is now viewed as something as, I'd say a cult classic, and very much Frankenheimer's masterpiece. And if you were a Formula One fan at the time, as you were at the time, Richard, and I was alive in 1966, but I was only 3, it must have been incredible to see Formula One cars in glorious Technicolor. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's like the curate's egg, good in parts. In fact, to be fair to it, it's very good in parts. But that does also mean it's bad in parts. boring in parts, schmaltzy in parts. I'd put it this way, if I may. It's a 3 stars out of 5 movie over 3 hours. Hiding in there somewhere, ready to be released by a clever director's cut, is a 4 stars out of 5 movie of 2 hours 15 minutes. I'd love to see that.
You and you young people and your abbreviated attention spans. I don't know.
You young 61-year-olds. Yeah. Anyway, Richard, 5 years after Grand Prix, Steve McQueen gave us his epic racing film, Le Mans, and we've since had Ron Howard's Rush, about James Hunt's rivalry with Niki Lauda, on which I was a technical consultant, by the way.
Those were the good bits.
Not the rom-com bits. James Mangold's Ford versus Ferrari, also about Le Mans, and more recently still, Ferrari, the movie, Michael Mann's biopic of Enzo Ferrari. So, where does Grand Prix sit in your ranking of racing films, Richard? Is it number 1?
Yes, actually it is for me. All the films we've mentioned there have something to recommend them, as well as big drawbacks. Even Steve McQueen's Le Mans, which shows us how the cars looked and sounded in an absolute golden era of endurance racing, but it doesn't have anything remotely resembling proper characters or a plot. Grand Prix, Frankenheimer's film, simply has more that's good. Enough interesting characters, enough thought in the script, great settings, and a decent narrative arc, as they say. And if you're Hollywood, and this is important, the American wins.
Aha. Essential these days now.
But I think you're wrong about the length, Matt. It's trying to tell the story of a whole season. And you're particularly wrong about the romantic stuff, which makes it more than just another movie for motor racing anoraks.
If you say so,
And
Richard.
I am looking at you.
Yes.
In documentary terms, what makes it really valuable is that it's a record of Grand Prix racing in a vanished era. This was the first season of 3-litre cars, more powerful cars, very exciting, with V8s and V12s and even H16s, and some old 2-litre cars with, like Jim Clark was racing with a 2-litre engine, for instance, that season. And it was the time before seat belts and full-face helmets and balaclavas and proper marshalling and medical facilities. And it was the era of straw bales and all that kind of,
Yes.
all those things, telegraph poles and ditches and, farmhouses to run into.
Yeah.
So when John Frankenheimer's cameras take you around Monza in particular, with no chicanes to get in the way in those days, you really feel what it must have been like to take the Curva Grande or the Lesmos or the Parabolica in those machines, in those conditions. And also to have been a spectator, buying your ticket and accepting the almost complete absence of protection between you and the cars. All that, and François Hardy too.
And I don't disagree with you about all that. As I say, curate's sake, the good bits are very, very good.
But I do have one final little mystery. In the film's closing credits, the list of drivers appearing includes Nino Farina. Now, he was the very first world champion in 1950, and he'd have been almost 60 when Grand Prix was filmed. I'd looked and looked and looked at the film and never managed to spot him. Maybe he ended up on the cutting room floor, the cinema's equivalent of the gravel trap.
Well, maybe, but actually, I think I can explain that for you, Richard.
Mm-hmm. I can see a big anorak moment coming up.
A bit of an anorak moment coming up. Nino Farina died in June 1966, which is about the time, isn't it, when Grand Prix was beginning to be filmed.
They were shooting it.
Yeah, I think they started in May, but basically the same kind of time.
Yeah.
Anyway, he crashed his Lotus Cortina in the Alpes Savoie on his way from his home in Italy to the French Grand Prix at Reims. He crashed it on a high, sweeping, curving road in the Alps. Why did he want to attend that race? After all, as you say, he was approaching 60 and long retired. I mean, he raced on into his 40s, but not into his late 50s. He was long retired. Well, my understanding is that he'd been on his way to meet John Frankenheimer and Yves Montand, who were there at Reims despite no filming for the movie being done at that particular race, because he, Farina, had been contracted as an advisor to and a driving double for Montan. So I guess he was included in the credits for that reason.
Thank you for that. A splendid anorak moment there.
Very good. I'm grateful to end on an anorak fact or an anorak moment, and that does feel like the perfect time to say, and colossally, that's history. Roll end credits.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks so much to everyone who's joined us for this episode. If this is your first episode of Colossally, be sure to go and dive into the back catalogue.
Absolutely, and if you'd like to share your thoughts on Grand Prix, the movie, we'd love to hear from you.
Just don't call it a rom-com. Right?
I won't. Okay, it's got rom-com bits. Okay. But if you disagree, you can always tell us, and you can tell us via what I'm going to say now. You can reach us on podcasts@the-race.com or via social media. I'm at the Bish F1 and Richard is at R. Williams 1947.
And remember, if you'd like to listen to these episodes ad-free or spoil yourself with some Colossally merchandise, there are links to both the Race Members Club and the Race Shop in the description of this episode.
And that's all for this episode, but please join us again next week when we'll be examining another slice of motor racing history. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.
You know that feeling, the rush of holding a piece of sports history in your hand, how it connects us to our past and present like nothing else can. Catch the thrill when you shop the unrivaled selection at eBay, the home of collectibles since 1995. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going to ebay.com/theathletic. That's ebay.com/theathletic. Start building your collection today.